Okay, so let's do a walkthrough on how to set up Excel and then solve the previous problem using Excel. To the lower left here, I have the summary of the mathematical model we created. On the upper left-hand side, I have my cheat sheet, which you guys should have as well when you come in to take the exam. And then, of course, to the right is my blank Excel sheet. When we start solving these types of problems, we're going to first focus on creating the objective function. So decision variables. And in this case, our decision variables are for chocolate chip cookies, sugar cookies, and chocolate fudges. All right, so let's plug in some values for these variables. But before I do so, I want to change the colors of the cells to remind us that these are the cells that Excel will be solving for. Let's start with one batch of chocolate chip cookies, 2 for sugar cookies, and 3 for chocolate fudges. This will help us check to make sure we set up the system correctly. Okay, so we have the decision variables put in. Now we need to add our coefficients, which we see here are 30, 20, and 45. Although we could technically here just put in the coefficients of 30, 20, and 45, in this case, we need to include the data that was given to us in the problem that we used to generate these numbers. So, looking at the problem again, we see that we're making a batch of 20 chocolate chip cookies, a batch of 20 sugar cookies, and a batch of 30 squares. And we're selling each one for $1.50 for chocolate chips, $1 for sugar cookies, and then $1.50 for our chocolate fudges. Okay, let's fix the format. And let's label our rows. And now we put in the formula so that we know that we got a price of $30 a batch by multiplying 20 by $1.50 a cookie. And now we just copy this formula to all the cells to the right. And then this way, not only do we see how we came up with these figures, but if any part of the problem changes in the future, we just need to make one tiny change to update the entire spreadsheet. For example, if we increase the price of the sugar cookie to $1.50, the price per patch will increase from $20 to $30. All right, let's put it back. Now that we've taken care of the variables, it's time to put this all together in our objective function. So let's create our objective function cell. And we'll make this cell orange because this cell will contain our calculations. All right, so let's turn our objective function into an Excel formula. So all we're doing is taking each coefficient, multiplying it by its variable, and then adding the product of each. So 30 times 1 plus 20 times 2 plus 45 times 3. And here you have a choice. You can either type this in manually, like this, or you can use Excel's sum product function, which takes the sum of the products. So in this case, we're going to multiply the cookies by their price and then add the products together. And as you can see, we get the same value. And even though we haven't finished setting up this problem yet, we can already start to play around with it. For example, let's see what our earning potential would be if we sold 2 batches of chocolate chip cookies instead of just 1. And before I forget, let me just fix the formatting, $2. And we see that when we add another batch of chocolate chip cookies, our objective function increases by 30, which makes sense because each batch is $30. And just for fun, let's see what happens if we only make 1 batch of sugar cookies. Okay, now let's move on to our constraints. And we have butter, we have sugar, we have eggs, we have chocolate chips, and we also have our flour. And now we're ready to add the coefficients for each constraint. Let's start with butter. The recipe tells us that we need 2 sticks of butter for the chocolate chip cookies, 2 for the sugar cookies, and 2 for the chocolate fudges. All right, now let's look at the sugar constraint. We need 1 cup for the chocolate chips, 2 for the sugar cookies, and 1 for the chocolate fudges. And now we just do the same for the rest of the constraints. All right, so now that we have our constraints, similar to what we did with the objective function, we're going to take the sum of the products between each constraint and the value that we give the decision variables. So for example, let's look at the butter. So if you decide to do this manually, it would be the number of butter in a chocolate chip cookie times the batches of chocolate chip cookies, plus the amount of butter in your sugar cookies times the batches of your sugar cookies, plus the number of butters in your chocolate fudges times the number of batches of chocolate fudges you make. And this gives us a value of 12. And like I said earlier, a much easier way to do this would be to use Excel's sum product function, in which case we'll take the cells with the butter constraints, hit comma, and then include the cells with the decision variables, which also gives us a grand total of 12. So, if we make these amount of cookies, we will need at least 12 sticks of butter, and if we sell all of them, we can make $215. Now I'm just going to apply the formula to the rest of the constraints. And if you're going to use the fill down, don't forget to make the decision variables absolute by using Command T on a Mac, or if you're working off of the PC, I believe it's F4. And now the only thing missing from our Excel sheet are the perimeters for each constraint. So let's add those. And because the perimeters are on the right-hand side of the constraints, let's make a column here, RHS, right-hand side. And we just populate these fields with the corresponding limits. 6, 5, 12, 2, and 10. And with that, we now have our Excel model, and we're ready to use Excel to find the optimal number of cookies we need to sell in order to maximize our earning potential. Excel's Solver feature can be found by going to Tools and then selecting Solver. Once again, make sure that you have checked the Make Unconstrained Variables Non-Negative and that you're using the simplex linear programming method to solve this problem. All right, so we'll start by selecting our objective function, which is right here, E9. Okay, make sure that we have this area set to max because we're maximizing the function. Okay, now we're asked to identify the decision variable cells, which are right here. Finally, we add our constraints. Our cell references is where we put the formula in Excel, so these cells. And then we want less than or equal to our constraints, and our constraints are the limits, which we have right here on our right-hand side. And we're now finally to solve. So we hit solve. And then here, make sure you select the answer report and the sensitivity reports. We'll take a closer look at these reports in the next video. And hit enter. And with that, Excel has found our optimal value. So we can expect to make $85 if we make 0 batches of chocolate chip cookies, 2 batches of sugar cookies, and 1 batch of chocolate fudge. And then now moving on to the constraints, we see how much of each ingredients we would be using to make our cookies. And then notice here that all of the constraints are well within the limits of each ingredient's perimeter. And then finally, I'd like to draw your attention down here. This is where you'll find your answer report and your sensitivity report, which will go into more detail in the following video.